Did you feel like in your lessons at church you were learning how to draw upon the principles in the Book of Mormon and apply them into your life?
I don't feel like I was really taught well how to develop a relationship with Christ. But there was a guy ahead of him, Lahontai, who he poisoned by degrees. And when she read that, it was like the Spirit just hit her. That these shots are poisoning your son by degrees. And so I'm like, well, he's obviously wrong because the church isn't going to lie about something this big.
We wish that they wouldn't lie.
Yeah.
We start to wake up to like different areas of corruption, but the church is like, when we start to wake up, we're like, this is our stronghold. Like the church cannot have corruption. There's no way. This is our stronghold. And so we kind of reject the first things. When you see all the corruption over here seeping into the church, you're like, no, that can't happen.
Well, if you don't want a calling, don't dress like you want one. Don't wear a tie, wear sandals, don't wear a white shirt, and you become kryptonite to them all of a sudden.
The Book of Mormon was written for the people who read the Book of Mormon. That isn't the Protestants and the non-denominational Christians. That is the Mormons, the people reading the Book of Mormon.
If you could describe God in one word, it's love.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to episode 48 of the Clarity Podcast. I'm your host, Claire, and this week's guest was Scott Christensen. And Scott has a lot of really good insights and spiritual experiences. And my spirit just felt uplifted listening to his awakening journey. And I hope that you will feel uplifted in listening to his journey as well. So stay tuned for all this and more on this week's episode of the Clarity Podcast. Everyone has a journey they are walking. And along that road, we are met with potholes, road bumps, rain, storms, and sometimes just fog. But through it all, we're really just looking for one thing: clarity. Clarity so we can walk with confidence in that next step. There's one source I run to for that clarity. In the darkest of nights, Jesus offers me light that shines through even the thickest storms. Welcome to the Clarity Podcast, where we find clarity through the one who saves us all. And welcome to episode 48 of the Clarity Podcast. I'm your host, Claire, and this week's guest is Scott Christensen. Welcome to the podcast, Scott.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming. We are so excited to have an in-person interview. It's pretty rare that we actually have in-person interviews, so I appreciate you coming down here for the occasion.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, okay. Introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about who you are and where you're from and how old you are.
So I'm Scott Christensen, born and raised in Provo, Utah. Grew up most of my life. Well, spent most of my life here with the exception of a mission in Canada for 2 years, and then also lived in Las Vegas area for 6 to 7 years. And so I'm 41 years old. I'm a physical therapist and have a wife that's amazing and 8 kids that are just as awesome as my wife. So it's a good life.
Awesome. Okay. Let's jump into your childhood. Give us some context for your life. What religion were you raised in, and what was that like for you growing up?
So grew up in the LDS Church, Provo, Utah. Like I said, I grew up on a little hill called Grandview Hill, and it is like, it might be the highest percentage of LDS people in the world there. I think we might have had less than 5 non-members within our ward boundary. So my parents, my dad was from Seattle originally. My mom is from California. She was a convert to the church. She joined when she was about 12 years old. And then she moved to Provo to go to BYU, and that's where she met my dad. And that's why we ended up in Utah. So my childhood was great. I can't really point at any really negative experiences in the church and growing up in that environment. You know, there were some people I didn't get along with, some of the youth, but you know, just differences in personalities. I felt like my upbringing in the church was really good.
Yeah, I think that there is trials amongst like all religions, all groups of people. So it makes sense that some people are going to have good experiences in the church. Some people are going to have bad experiences in the church.
100%. Yeah.
So that's awesome that you had a good childhood, especially with like such a dense community of Mormons, because there are other people's stories that's not like that at all, you know?
I've heard them, and I sympathize with that, because you're right. Like, not everyone's experience is positive as mine, but I'm really grateful for my childhood. One of the kind of more formidable moments of my childhood is, when I grew up, going to church is just part of the culture. It's just what you do, right, every week. If you don't go, people notice, and then they're knocking on your door and like, hey, where are you? But I remember one of the things about church that was most impressive to me was fast and testimony meetings. And I remember going to these fast and testimony meetings, and people get up and they're bearing their testimony. They're talking about all these really spiritual experiences that they had. And, some of them are crying and just very emotional stories. And I remember listening to these experiences and just thinking, man, this is really interesting. I mean, I wish I had those experiences too, and I didn't feel like I had them. And I remember, I think I was about 12 years old. I asking my dad, like, hey, Dad, what does the Spirit feel like? I didn't feel like I knew what the Spirit felt like. And my dad is not like a man of many words. He's pretty quiet. He was a librarian. He liked to just kind of keep to himself. And I remember him just kind of thinking for a second and saying, well, it's like a warm feeling in your heart, like a burning in the bosom. I'm like, yeah, I've heard that before. And I'm like, okay, thanks, Dad. That's great. It didn't feel like it was really helpful, but I'm like, all right, just kind of accepted the answer. But I remember as a kid just kind of like struggling to understand what the Spirit felt like. It was kind of a big challenge for me. But moving along, I remember when I was 16 years old, there was one of the youth leaders in the ward. He came into the priest quorum one day. I was 16, and he asked a question, and he asked people to raise their hand if they had read the Book of Mormon all the way through. And then at the time, I had not done it myself personally, but as a family, we had, at one point, read through the Book of Mormon. We had took a chapter a night and got through the Book of Mormon. And so I kind of sheepishly rose my hand. I'm like, okay, I guess that counts, right? But anyways, he issued a challenge to the priests, and really it was to the whole, like all of young women's, all of young men, to read the Book of Mormon in a month. And so I'm like, okay, maybe I'll do that. And then he said that there was a prize if you did it. And the prize was that if you read the Book of Mormon in a month, that they would give you a basket full, like an Easter basket full of your favorite candy bar. So, way to motivate people. I mean, put it
with sugar.
Right. Yeah. With sugar. Right. Which is funny because it was a real motivator to me, because in my family, my parents were pretty healthy. Like they didn't.
So candy was not in your house.
It wasn't like we didn't have candy. The only time of the year that we got candy was Christmas in our stockings. Halloween, we would hand it out. My mom did not like us trick-or-treating because she was like, my kids are like begging from door to door. And so, this bribe essentially of, giving me a basket full of Snickers bar, because that was my favorite candy bar at the time, was like really enticing to me. And so I'm like, all right, I'm going to do this. And so I remember it was kind of funny. I'm like, all right, I'm going to do this. I'm going to read the Book of Mormon in a month, and I'm going to get my candy. And so a week goes by. I completely forgot about it. Same leader comes back, and he, is like kind of like this return and report type deal. Like he comes to class. He's like, all right, how many of you have been reading the Book of Mormon? And I hadn't. And so pretty much everyone in the class is like raising their hand because they all wanted the candy just as bad as I did. And I couldn't raise my hand. I'm like, man, this is kind of embarrassing. And so from that day, I'm like, all right, I'm going to do this. And so I looked at the Book of Mormon and I counted how many pages. I just flipped to the back. All right, there's 531 pages or something like that. And so I'm like, all right, I've got 23 days or whatever it was. And so I calculated, like, how many pages do I have to read every single day until I finish this Book of Mormon in time? And so it was like that, between 20 to 30 pages. And so that day I sat down and I read my 20 to 30 pages and got through it. And it took me a long time. I was not like the fastest reader, but I got through it. And so I was able to finish the Book of Mormon in the month. And I was pretty proud of myself for that. But it was interesting because something unexpected happened. You know, prior to this, like, you go to church and, you know, they always tell you, you know, read your scriptures, say your prayers, go to church, you know, do all this stuff. And it just seemed like kind of like a chore to me, you know. Mm-hmm. It's like a little checklist. Yeah. You know, and I didn't expect to actually enjoy the Book of Mormon.
Because when you're a kid, you don't.
You don't, right?
Right.
But, you know, like, you go to Sunday school and they, you know, the teacher's teaching the lesson and you're going through these scriptures and stuff and you read them and they tell you the stories. And so you become familiar with them, but it's just like, you know, as a kid, it's just kind of hard to sit through class sometimes. And so I didn't really expect to enjoy reading it. But when I read it, and I read it as quickly as I did enjoy reading. I liked fantasy novels and reading those, and I read quite a bit. But when I read the Book of Mormon quickly through, it's like these stories like started to come alive to me. And it was like, man, this is really pretty cool. You know, you start reading about the war chapters in Alma, and as a young man.
Yep.
Yeah.
You're like, war.
Right. Yeah. And I'm like reading about Teancum, like going in the Lamanite camp and, you know, killing Amalickiah and Amaron, his brother. I'm like, man, this is really cool. You know, these stories that I'd never, you know. Anyways, it was a great experience. But so the funny thing is by the end of me finishing it, you know, I was familiar with Moroni's promise at the end, you know, Moroni 10, 3-5, you know, once you've read these things, if it be wisdom in God, that you should read them, that you would ask God in the name of Christ if these things are not true. And if they are, if God will manifest the truth of it unto you by the power of the Holy Ghost. And so, you know, again, like, just, you know, you grow up in the church and you know the steps, right? Mm-hmm. Pray about it, you get an answer, mm-hmm. right? Go to church, you're blessed. Pay your tithing, you're going to be financially secure the rest of your life, you know?
Yeah. Jesus suffered so we don't have to, right? Yep.
Right, yeah. And so I remember at the end of reading the Book of Mormon for the first time, like, all right, I'm going to kneel down, I'm going to pray, and I'm going to get my answer. Like, these people that are bearing their testimonies that I hear every single week in church that are talking about these spiritual experiences, I'm going to have my turn, right? And so I remember kneeling down at my bed and praying and feeling nothing. And it was really interesting. It was very kind of disappointing, actually. But it kind of wore off, and I just like, well, okay, well, I guess I didn't get my answer, but I kept going and kept reading the Book of Mormon. I read it a couple more times before my mission. I read the New Testament. I read the Doctrine and Covenants. I just kind of got into the habit of it. I'd read a chapter at night. Sometimes I'd stay awake for the whole chapter. Sometimes I'd fall asleep, you know, but I tried to develop a a regular habit of reading scriptures. So
Did you feel like you strengthened your relationship with Jesus Christ through that constant study habit that you were creating as a kid?
if I did, I think so. I think that the habit that I developed was a good habit. The relationship, I wasn't much of a prayer. Is that a word?
A prayer.
Prayer.
Sort of a prayer.
I didn't pray a lot,
Okay.
but I read the scriptures and I liked, for the most part, I liked attending church. I felt uplifted by it. But if there was a relationship being developed with God, and there was improvement in that, it was very gradual, almost imperceptible,
Did you feel like in your lessons at church you were learning how to draw upon the principles in the Book of Mormon and apply them into your life?
That's a great question. I really liked my youth leaders, but I don't feel like I was really taught well how to develop a relationship with Christ.
Mm-hmm.
That might have been because I wasn't listening as much as I should have and wasn't putting as much effort into it as I should have. But I feel like the church could do a better job for sure of helping people not to just, I hate to say go through the motions, but like to really dig in and figure out how to commune with God.
Mm-hmm. I'm reading a book currently and it's called Outwitting the Devil. And I would recommend this book to anybody. But in this book, he talks about what's called drifters. And drifters are people that they just kind of go throughout the motions and they check the boxes and they do what they're told. And basically it teaches that one of the greatest enemies to Satan is people who think for themselves and they're not drifting. And so do you feel like maybe there's a culture of drifting in the church that puts us in this place where we're maybe not doing as much as we could be to teach our children to be applying principles of the gospel into our lives?
Yes, absolutely. It sounds like an interesting book.
Yeah.
It's kind of easy to just coast and just go through the rituals, of going to church and doing things.
Yes.
So for sure.
And I think everybody can actually fall into drifting no matter what religion you are, or even those of us in this place where we're like awake. So like we know stuff, but we can fall into drifting too. And so I think when you think about it that way and you realize how Satan can get to us, it makes you want to like put on the gas pedal with the effort that we put into really having a relationship with Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm.
So do you feel like you were able to kind of transition into that as you got older?
Took a long time. So
let's transition into your mission a little bit then.
Sure.
So tell us about your mission, why you chose to go on a mission, and where you served.
I chose to go on the mission because that's what you're supposed to do.
Because you were drifting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I agree, and I was, I always accepted that I was going to do it. I wasn't necessarily excited about it. I do remember, when the missionaries would come home from the war, the guys that were older than me, they'd come home and report on their missions. I do remember feeling like there was changes in them, and some more than others, right? But I remember looking at these returned missionaries, where they were elders or sisters, and just thinking, man, that's really cool, and really admiring them and wanting that for myself. But at the same time, I'm like a person who is all about efficiency and using time wisely. And I was really young for my grade. And so I had a whole year. This is when you went as a 19-year-old instead of 18. When they changed it to 18, I was so jealous.
Really?
Oh yeah, because I graduate, I'm 17. I turned 18 in June. I had to wait a whole year to go. And so I was just ready to get out there. I'm like, if I'm going to do this, let's get this done and over with, right? And move on with life.
Sure.
But when I went on my mission, I was really serious about it. The scripture on my mission plaque, in fact, I got a Book of Mormon right here. It's Jacob 1:19. This kind of encapsulates my mentality as a missionary. Jacob 1:19, it says, This is Jacob talking about him and Joseph and their duties as priests and teachers to the people. They say, "And we did magnify our office unto the Lord, taking upon us the responsibility, answering the sins of the people upon our own heads, if we did not teach them the word of God with all diligence. Wherefore, by laboring with our might, their blood might not come upon our garments. Otherwise, their blood would come upon our garments, and we would not be found spotless at the last day." I remember reading this as a mission prior to my mission, and just thinking, it just hit me. It's like, if you're going to go out and work, and this is the consequence of you being a lazy missionary and not doing what you're supposed to do, that the people that you could have reached that you didn't because of, you're not faithful, you're just staying in your apartment or whatever, their blood's going to come upon my garments. Like, I'm not having that. And so I really, really worked hard on my mission. And sometimes it just drove my companions absolutely crazy because I was so worried. I was like a pretty guilt-stricken person. Like, I don't want, their blood to come upon my garments. So I worked really, really hard.
Yep, because that's the next thing that Satan uses. If he can't get us to drift, then he uses guilt and shame and fear.
Yeah,
and so
for sure.
We just kind of shift into these places. And I wish we would teach these things more in society, so we could teach young people from a young age how to get out of these patterns. Because how much more effective would you have even been on your mission if you could have gotten out of the guilt and just was focused on doing things in the love of God, So very interesting. Tell us a little bit more about your mission. Tell us how you grew closer to Christ on your mission and some of your good experiences.
Okay, so I kind of going back to my story about reading the Book of Mormon. Didn't really get an answer to my prayer, at least not the one that I anticipated and hoped for. But when I got on my mission, I remember starting over in the Book of Mormon, and I was just going to plow through it like I did the first time I read it. Just read a ton and get through as quick as I could. And same type of deal happened. I remember reading it, and again, the stories just kind of, they came alive. Okay. The same war chapters that I thought were awesome were awesome. But there were two, excuse me, there were two parts of the Book of Mormon as I was reading it that really were very impactful on me. And one of them was, strangely enough, it was the story of Alma the Younger and Amulek preaching to the people in Ammonihah. And I remember reading, just this horrific account of, them getting tied up and all the women and the children and the scriptures just getting thrown into the fire. And I don't know why, but I remember reading that and just feeling the Spirit just extremely strong, just testifying to me that this account, this story specifically of Alma and Amulek and this mass martyrdom actually happened. And I don't know why such a sad story had such an impact on me, but it did. And then at the end of the Book of Mormon, again, I got to Moroni chapter 10, and I remember reading just probably like the last half of the Book of Moroni. And again, that same spirit that I felt when I was reading the account of Alma and Amulek, it came upon me. And it's hard to describe what it felt like. It was almost like a fiery sensation in my body, but maybe like, I was thinking about this the other day. It almost felt like an energy in my body that was just intense, but it wasn't just in me. I could feel it in the room, like in the entire room I was in. It was amazing. And then I remember praying at that time, like, is the Book of Mormon true? And I already knew because of what I was feeling. And so that, I didn't know what it was. I mean, I knew it was a spirit, but I didn't know the significance of that experience. As I reflect on it now, I think it was a little bit more significant than I thought at the time. But it was really, and that experience has really been an anchor to me the rest of my life. I mean, I've read the scriptures regularly over the years. I've been very consistent at it, and I have a real passion for it. But that experience, probably more than anything, has been the most memorable experience I've had reading the scriptures. So, the prayer that I had when I was a 16-year-old, I think the reward, I think God has kind of a sense of humor, and he gives us what we want, right? I was going for the candy bars when I was a 16-year-old kid, and hoping for this big spiritual experience. But I think God was kind of telling me, you did this for the candy bars. I got something out of it. I really enjoyed reading it, but that was my reward. But when I was a missionary, I wasn't even really asking for this overwhelming spiritual experience, but that's what I got. So it was really cool.
Yeah, that's really neat. Once you have a witness from the Holy Spirit like that, then when stuff later in life comes along, like nothing can budge you. Like it's that firm foundation that is talked about, that Jesus Christ is the firm foundation. So when he gives you witnesses like that, it just changes everything for the rest of your journey.
It does. Yeah.
All right. So let's transition a little bit. Coming home from your mission, tell me the difference between spirituality on the mission versus maybe what you were doing after the mission. Did it change? Was it similar? Tell me about that.
I tried to keep it the same. And for a while, I was able to maintain that. I would read my scriptures a lot. But life kind of catches up to you. I got busy with school, started dating, and it didn't completely just fall off, but like it definitely took a dip. So.
Okay. All right. So tell us a little bit about what you were doing at this time. Tell us how you met your wife, what that was like.
So my mission president was a Doctrine and Covenants and church history professor at BYU. He was a great guy, and he just had a way of really drawing from church history to teach really important lessons to missionaries. And because of that, it got me really interested in church history. And so when I got home, I was at UVSC initially, and I decided to take a church history class. And lo and behold, there's this cute girl in the class that it turned out to be my wife. She was at that time I was practicing with the track team at UVU, and they had these generic UVU athletic T-shirts for all the athletes. It didn't even tell you what sport you were doing. It was like a UVSC athletics. And so she was wearing one. I'm like, oh, what sport do you play? And she said soccer. And so I just started talking to her, and we sat by each other in class. And I had a rule. I was just like the typical awkward return missionary. Didn't know how to talk to girls. Just like, it was kind of funny, kind of pathetic. But I had a rule. I'm like, all right, if I'm going to date, I don't want to date someone in one of my classes. Okay, I know that sounds weird. And I didn't want to date someone that was in the singles ward either.
That's where you meet people when you're LDS.
I know, right? But I'm like, I was mortified that if it went bad, then I'd be stuck in a class with them. Or I'd be stuck in the ward with them. It'd just be awkward. And so, I'm chatting with my wife, and I'm going to Institute every day and chatting with this girl and kind of like her. And so anyways, went through the semester. I was actually dating another girl a little bit at this time, and so by the end of the semester, the girl I was dating just went down in a ball of flames. But it's a good thing.
Okay.
But anyway, so once that ended, I called up, Heidi, my wife, and asked her out on a date, and we started dating. And after 4 months of dating, we got engaged, and 4 months later, we got married. So
Nice.
I was home from my mission just a little bit over a year by the time we got married, which is funny because when I got home talking to all my friends, I just told them, I'm like, I'm going to be the last one that gets married. I'm probably going to be like in my late 20s, early 30s. Before I get married, I'm just going to have fun. And I was like one of the first ones that got married.
It's always the opposite of what we want or think that it's going to go.
That is so true.
Yep.
I've got a family member that was the exact opposite. He was just chomping at the bit to get married. While he was a missionary, he was just talking about, I can't wait to get home and get married and have a bunch of kids. And he's in his early 30s now, and he's still single.
Yep.
Which is fine, right?
So the secret is, if you want marriage, just don't want it. Okay?
I guess so. It'll happen though, right?
Yeah. Well, everybody's story is different.
Everyone's story is
timetable
different.
is different.
Yeah, definitely.
Yep. Okay. All right. So you get married. Were you married in the temple?
We were married in the Salt Lake Temple.
Okay.
And there's kind of a funny story about this because as I was thinking about my journey, as I was getting ready for this interview, I remembered we got married in the Salt Lake Temple. My parents had gifted me just this old 1992 Volkswagen Jetta as a wedding present. Manual transmission. I loved it. It used to be my brother's car. He had this massive 12-inch subwoofer in the back. So it was this kind of junky looking car, but man, it had some serious bass to it. It was pretty awesome. But anyways, when we were driving home from the wedding, I wasn't actually in the jet. For some reason, I was driving my dad's truck home from the wedding, and my wife is sitting next to me, my new bride, and she's in her wedding dress still. I'm in a tux, and I remember driving down I-15 to go to the reception, and I had this really, really apprehensive, nervous feeling. Not because I just gotten married, but like it was with driving, and I was going the speed limit, but something was like giving me like just kind of like just this nervous on edge feeling. And I remember just trying to ever so slightly pull out of the far left lane, and then all of a sudden the truck just starts fishtailing. Just like totally unexpectedly, and it took me a little bit. Like I was afraid it was going to spin out of control and we were going to crash, but I was able to get it under control and then drive off. But I've thought about that, and I'm like, I really felt that was opposition from the adversary. This newly married couple,
Yes.
trying to move on with our marriage.
Oh, yeah.
And I swear there was some opposition there to our marriage. It was just really kind of a weird experience.
I have found that when two people are creating a union together in the sight of God with the intention to follow God, there will be opposition. And I wish they would have talked about that in the church, because I did not understand that when I was younger.
It totally
But
is.
it's a real thing. And so we have to learn to discern, like, is this just Satan, or is it, and then when we learn to discern, we learn how to basically take away Satan's power so that we can continue doing what God needs us to do. So yeah, It probably was. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's transition a little bit. What were you doing in the church at the time? You start to have your kids, you're newly married, and what did your church life look like?
Just typical true believing Mormon. Went to church. We had kids pretty early on. I was just barely 23 when we had our first kid. My wife was 21, and so we were pretty young and had had our first, and then we had our second one shortly after that. At that time, so I was just going to church, fulfilling callings. We were teaching primary. I was secretary in the Sunday school presidency, which I jokingly referred to as the assistant bell ringer. But I teach the elders quorum lesson every once in a while when they asked for a volunteer, but that was basically it.
Okay. All right. So you were pretty faithful member your whole life, growing up in the church. I'm sure you probably didn't have any doubts about the church at any particular time, did you?
No, not at all.
Okay. So let's transition to your awakening journey.
Okay.
What happened?
So I went to, as part of my training as a physical therapist, I had to go to graduate school. Kind of an interesting story. One of the struggles I had growing up, partly due to my own fault, was with school. Like in high school, I was not very disciplined. I didn't try very hard. And then when I was on my mission, I kind of had a wake up call to, if you want to be successful in life, if I wanted to be successful in life, I better get my act together and actually put forth some effort with my education. And so I did a complete 180 when I got home from my mission and really took school very seriously. I studied very hard, but I feel like because of my lack of effort early on, I was kind of playing some catch up. And so my bachelor's degree, I got it at BYU, and BYU is extremely competitive. And I remember just really struggling to feel like I was going to get the GPA and the grades I needed in order to get into graduate school. I wasn't doing bad. I was doing maybe a little bit above average, but it was a struggle. For the amount of time I was putting into it, I felt like I wasn't getting the grade point average that I hoped. And so I was really kind of concerned I was going to get into graduate school. And so I remember applying to 5 or 6 different programs. I got waitlisted at one, a couple, I think. And I was thinking I wasn't going to get accepted. And then my saving grace was the entrance exam. I did fairly well on that. And so I eventually got off of the wait list to UNLV out in Las Vegas, which was my wife's last choice. Of the places that I applied to, she's like, no way I want to go to Vegas.
I don't blame her. I wouldn't either.
But as fate would have it, that was my only option. And I'm really glad that we went there, because that's a huge part of my journey, was living in Las Vegas.
Really?
Yes. It's not what people think.
Really? Okay, how did that play out? Explain that to us.
So I got in, obviously, but as far as lifestyle there, it's just really like anywhere else, just hot. And you go into a gas station, there's slot machines. And there's lots of casinos. But, as an LDS person, I'm not going to go into the casinos.
Right.
The only time you go into a casino in Las Vegas is to go to the movie theater, because oftentimes the movie theaters are in the casinos. And so you have to walk through the smoke and stuff. But anyways, but outside of that, it's just like any other city. And so we met some really, really great people in the church in Las Vegas. I was there for 2 years, the first 2 years of grad school. And then the third year, we came back to Utah, where I had all my clinicals. And then I graduated, and then looking for jobs, and best paying job I could find. Because I was just all about, again, efficiency. I got to pay off my student loans now and get that behind me. Mm-hmm. And so I found some really great jobs in Las Vegas doing home health care. And so we decided to move back, and we moved into a ward. And I remember the first Sunday that we were there, there was this guy in the ward. he became a really good friend of mine. But I remember sitting in gospel doctrine class. This is back when church is 3 hours. And so I remember sitting in gospel doctrine class, and I don't remember the question. I don't remember his answer, but I remember him raising his hand and answering the question the teacher posed to the class, and just being blown away by his answer. I'm just like, man, that was really, really insightful. And then elders quorum came, and again, teacher asks a question. This same guy raises his hand and just like a mic drop answer, just like, whoa, that's kind of mind blowing. I remember talking to my wife afterwards. I'm like, you see that guy? We need to have his wife and him over for dinner sometime. He's smart. And so anyways, in that ward, I, again, I'm still TBM mindset. At this time though, the nature of my job was, I would go from house to house working with people. I worked with a lot of geriatric people at that time, and which is I could go and tell you stories about people and their interesting lives. You work in Vegas, and you meet all sorts of just super interesting people. Mm-hmm. I met a lady that dated Elvis Presley for 2 years.
Wow,
it was crazy. I met another lady that was a little Jewish lady that was in Auschwitz in the concentration camp.
Wow.
Yeah, she had the tattoo still
Whoa.
on her arm.
Mm.
Really interesting city, and really interesting people there. But anyways, getting back to the ward there. So I again at TBM, but as I was go from appointment to appointment, I got tired of listening to music, and so I started tuning into the AM radio, listening to talk radio. And, coming from Utah, red state, conservative Utah, I naturally kind of gravitated towards, some of the guys I had heard about, like Sean Hannity, Rush Limbaugh, Michael Savage. And I really did not know much about politics at all at that point. And so it was kind of like nice to feel like I was informed and get more sped up on what's going on with the current politics. But anyways, I came to the realization, I'm like, in the Book of Mormon, it talks about these secret combinations in the government. I'm like, these guys on these talk radio shows, they're talking about some pretty shady stuff too. And so I'm like, yeah, they're secret combinations. I knew they were there. I accepted that as I read the Book of Mormon, but like, here it is, like they're talking about it, and I know that these radio show hosts that I'm talking about, they come from a biased perspective, but like some of their points really resonated with me. So anyways, that was kind of like the beginning of my wake up. It was a political side of things, but the spiritual side, and it got deeper. Okay. So this same guy in the ward, I'll call him Dave. That's not his real name. Okay. I want to keep his identity secret here.
Yeah.
Okay. But he has an online presence, and so people would be able to identify him if I disclose too much. But anyways, Dave, I was called as the Elders Quorum secretary, and the Elders Quorum president at the time I was initially called, he got released, and then the new Elders Quorum president was Dave. Okay. And so I got to know Dave pretty well. I would go out on visits with him, be in meetings with him. We got to become pretty good friends. Anyways, as we were, I forget, he told me about another talk radio guy, Alex Jones. I'm sure you've heard of him.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
It was funny, his initial description of Alex Jones. He's telling me about him. He's telling me about just this humble guy from Austin, Texas that has all these interesting guests on. And I'm like, oh, cool. I'll listen to him. And I remember tuning into Alex Jones, and he's just like going on one of these rants, and just the guy is anything but quiet and humble. The dude's like got sandpaper as vocal cords. But like he was talking about things that were just crazy sounding, like 9/11 being an inside job. He was talking about vaccinations and the danger of vaccinations and fluoride being in the water and, GMOs and all this stuff, right? And it was just so shocking that I couldn't not listen, but I didn't buy hardly any of it. I'm like, no way. And so, but I kept listening to him just for the sure entertainment factor. And I told my wife about him, and my wife, for those who know my wife, she's very soft-spoken, like very polite, just toe the line, mainstream, at least I thought, mainstream like personality. And so I kind of jokingly told her, I'm like, hey, you should listen to this guy. And thinking that she would it'd be way too much for her. And I came home one day and she's like, hey, listen to that guy. I'm like, oh, really? What'd you think? She's like, yeah, he's pretty interesting. But she totally took to him, which shocked me. But anyways, one of the subjects that was really kind of a sore one for me, and this is part of my wake up journey. It ties into some later events. Was the subject of vaccinations. All right, so my education, I've taken a lot of science classes to get where I'm at. I've taken a lot of the same classes that people who go to med school do, and not as much, but like a lot of the same ones. And so by the time I was at where I at postgraduate school, my opinion on that subject was it's good, like, yeah, vaccinate your kids for these diseases so they don't get them. It just made sense to me, Mm-hmm. I'd gone through the indoctrination process there. And then I found out that, I'm listening to Alex Jones and he's talking about the dangers of vaccines. And then I found out through the grapevine that my friend, Dave, did not vaccinate his children. And I'm like, oh crap. And I'm like, I don't know about that. Like, I don't know if my kids should be playing around his kids. And that was how like ignorant I was
Mm-hmm.
of that subject. But I had too much respect for him. I'm like, no, I'm not going to do that. But like the thought did go through my head.
Mm-hmm.
And so my wife found out that he had done quite a bit of research on this. And she's like, I want you to get a hold of his research. Because she didn't tell me this, but like when she took our kids into appointments, she always had this kind of uneasy feeling about it, but she just went with it. Mm-hmm. And then we had at the time we really started looking into this. I got hold of his research and started reading through it. And at the time we were up to 4 kids. Our 4th was our first son, and he was about 6 months old at that time. And he started to have some pretty severe gastrointestinal issues. Mm. And at the time we were going to the temple once a week, like really being diligent with that and trying to get answers to prayers and guidance in our life. And my wife, one of her biggest concerns was our son, like what is going on with him. And at the same time that's happening, we're studying about vaccines and going through the research, going through the CDC's website, learning about I can't remember off the top of my head, but the fund that gives back money to people who have been injured for vaccine. VAERS is what it's called. Mm-hmm. Looking into that, I got some books about it, and we started to get more uneasy about it. My wife, as she was kind of wrestling with our son's health issues, she said that one day she was reading the scriptures, funny enough, in the war chapters, and she was reading the account of Amalickiah, him taking over the Lamanite government, and the first thing he did was to take over as like the commander of the Lamanite armies, but there was a guy ahead of him, Lahontai, who he poisoned by degrees. And when she read that, it was like the Spirit just hit her. And she's like, that's your answer. That these shots are poisoning your son by degrees. And so from that, she just stopped cold turkey.
Wow. And there's warnings in the Book of Mormon too, where the Nephites specifically said we were very careful not to partake of the poisons that the Lamanites, who were the enemy at the time, that the Lamanites were trying to give us. So like, so much connection in the war chapters. Go read the war chapters.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. But yeah, so she went to the next well child checkup after that. She comes home and she tells me, hey, Scott, like, yeah, I went to the doctor's appointment. None of our kids got shots. And I'm like, ooh. I kind of had to bite my tongue.
Cringing a little bit.
Yeah, I was not quite there, but I'm like, I just kind of went with it.
Mm-hmm.
And I kept doing my own research, and it was kind of a gradual thing, but I came to eventually the same conclusion that she did, that they're not what they are touted to be, So that was a big part of my wake up journey, which ties into later on down the road.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. All right. So you mentioned in your pre-notes, before we even get to 2020, which I'm sure that's when that ties in. Before we get to that, you mentioned in your notes about being introduced to the idea that Joseph Smith isn't a polygamist. So tell me about that.
Yeah. So this is a really good lesson on mentors. This Dave guy, whose name's not really Dave, he was just such a profound person to me, and we're still very good friends to this day. But while we were, while I was in serving the elders quorum with him, while we were out on one of our visits, he told me of an experience that he had, and I'm not going to relate all the details, but because it's his story to tell. But it was a really incredible experience that he had, and so much so that when he told it to me, I was thinking to myself, did he get his calling and election made sure? Like, is this a second comforter experience that he's telling me about? And I was just shocked by it in a good way, right? I'm like, man, I believed him. I totally believed him. But I was a little confused because in the church, we're told that we don't share those type of experiences, right? They're too sacred to tell.
Yeah, it's casting your pearls before swine.
Yeah. Which now I completely reject that idea. Right. But anyways, he, along my journey, has been a real mentor to me along the way. He's not a perfect person. He has his flaws just like everyone else, but really, really solid guy. But anyways, it's funny, every time he would tell me something new, I'd always doubt it. And then I do research. I'm like, oh my gosh, he's right. He's right again. And so, it's kind of like that joke about Alex Jones, for every time he's right, that people don't think he's right. I've got a t-shirt that says Alex Jones was right, but, but my kids gave it to me. But anyways, Dave, I don't know how it came up. I think I heard through the grapevine again that him and his wife didn't believe that polygamy was a thing, that it was a correct doctrine, and they didn't believe that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. This was back in 2013 or 14, way back, right? And I'm like, you got to be kidding me. Of course he was. I had heard of it years before, and I had looked into it a little bit just on the internet, and came across some stuff about polyandry and Joseph marrying women who were already married, and I just got this sick feeling about it. I'm like, oof, I don't think I should dive into this. I think this is probably too much to me. But then I heard, fast forward to this point in time, I heard that Dave and his wife didn't believe in that. I'm like, what? And so I started asking him about that, and he gave me some of the reasons. And I remember at the time thinking no, he's been right about so many things, but this is too far. The church their narrative of the church. I had read the gospel topic essays on like all of them, and one on polygamy too. I'm like, it was clearly established there what the church's stance was on it, that they accepted that he was practicing polygamy. And so I'm like, well, they're not going to lie, you know?
We wish that they wouldn't lie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, well, he's obviously wrong because the church isn't going to lie about something this big,
Yeah.
you know? And so I didn't really listen to him. In fact, I kind of like tried to reclaim him a little bit. I remember somehow I came across a Brian Hales interview on polygamy, and he was addressing all the hard questions about it, and they made sense to me. I'm like, oh, okay, well, yeah, this is how you explain it. And I remember sending it to him, and in my effort to reclaim him from his error, and he listened to it, and he's like, yeah, I actually really respect Brian Hales and the research that he's done, but I still don't believe Joseph was a polygamist. And he gave off some reasons why. And so that was my introduction to the idea, and I totally just didn't buy it because I was in that TBM mindset.
Yeah. It's very interesting because we start to wake up to like different areas of corruption, but the church is like, when we start to wake up, we're like, this is our stronghold. Like, the church cannot have corruption. There's no way. This is our stronghold. And so we kind of reject the first things. When you see all the corruption over here seeping into the church, you're like, no, that can't happen.
Yeah.
But it happens. And so like people are always like, Claire, you can't say there's corruption in the church. That's so offensive. And I'm like, I think there's corruption everywhere. It's less offensive when you think that it's everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think the problem is I really feel like I love the church. I don't want to come across too negative about it, but the problem is, in my mind, is that there's this false doctrine that's been taught that the leaders can do no wrong. With the manifesto with Wilford Woodruff, that statement that I don't remember it word for word, but essentially, if he were to attempt to lead the saints astray, the Lord would remove him out of his place. And that to me was like, I accepted him as a prophet. And so if that's what a prophet said, that's like God speaking. And so therefore, this is the law. This is unadulterated truth right there. And so members of the church that have that mindset like I did, you can't see past that. And so it doesn't matter how logical the argument is, how much facts are presented. If that is your paradigm and that's your accepted truth, you're not going to listen.
Yeah, definitely. Do you have tips for helping people out of that paradigm?
Oh, man.
Because you came out of the paradigm, right?
Yeah. I really feel like it's got to be God that helps you get out of that. So fast forward, we ended up moving back to Utah after about 4 years of being in Las Vegas. We moved back because of what we felt was inspiration, which it was. And we thought it was going to be all peaches and cream when we moved here. It's just going to be that next step, we're going to go from this level to this level. We're going to make more money. We're going to be more successful. We're going to be, have these other callings in the church. It's just like from one level to another, and eventually you get to the celestial kingdom.
And what year was this that you made this move?
We moved back in 2015.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. So we moved back, and we quickly learned that it wasn't smooth sailing.
Especially once you got to 2020.
Right. And so we had some issues with our living situation, finding out where we were going to move. We were big into emergency preparedness at the time. And so we were looking for a bigger lot. And this is a whole other story that I could go off on for hours, and I won't. But eventually we purchased a piece of land out in the west side of the county. We got on 5.5 acres out there. And built a house there. And at this time, I had a main job. I had a home health care job that I was doing, and that wasn't going great. It was there were ups and downs. And I also had a company in Nevada that I had kept. And so I was doing that. I was traveling back to Las Vegas, doing work on the weekends, 2-3 times a month, working home health care, which was not going well. And so I had to create more work. And so eventually started my own company, which morphed into what I'm doing right now. And anyways, the point being is I had a lot of irons in the fire. And I was just doing too much. I couldn't take it all. And so I had to pick and choose what I wanted to do. Because the family was really kind of suffering because of it, because I was working so much. Anyways, it got to a point where through a lot of prayer and pondering about things, fasting, I came to the decision I needed to quit my home health care job and I needed to start my own business. And at that time, we had been living in this new house for about a year at that time, very new to the ward there. And I quit my job, opened this business, and literally, so the week I quit my job, I was still traveling back and forth between Utah and Las Vegas. And I remember I was driving one night to Las Vegas to do work on the weekend, and I get a call on my cell phone, and it was an 801 area code. And when I was going to Vegas, it was like, that was my mindset. Utah's over here. I'm in Nevada. That's my focus. And so if someone was calling me from a Utah number and it wasn't in my phone, let it go to voicemail. I'll just deal with it when I get back. Anyways, I look at this call. I don't know whose number it is. I'm like, oh, what the heck? I'll see who this is. So I answer the phone and I'm like, hello, this is Scott. And I don't remember the person's name, but they're like, hey, this is brother so-and-so from the stake. And I'm like, the stake? And I'm like thinking, why in the world would the stake be calling me? And I'm like, do they want me to speak in stake conference or something? And so I'm like, all right, what can I do for you? And he's like, well, the stake president, a member of the stake presidency, was wondering if you and your wife could come down to the stake center at 9:00 and talk with them. And immediately I'm like, oh no.
You've been summoned for a potential large calling.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and I knew immediately. The bishop had been in for almost 4 or 5 years at that time, I forget. And so I knew it's got to have something to do with that. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, well, I can't. I'm on my way to Las Vegas right now for some work, and I'm in Fillmore. So it's 8:00. There's no way I can make it in time, and I got to be working tomorrow. But I can get on a conference call with you guys, with my wife, if that's okay. And he's like, well, let me see. Let me check and see if that's okay with the member of the presidency. And so he puts me on hold, comes back a minute later. He's like, yeah, that'll be fine. And just call this number at 9:00. And so I hang up the phone. I call my wife immediately. I'm like, Heidi, I just got a really strange call from the stake. And she's like, what? I'm like, well, they want us to meet at the church at 9:00. I told them that I can't. I'm driving to Vegas, but they're okay if we conference call them and talk to them that way. And she's like, okay. So I hang up, and the whole hour I'm just like, oh no. I'm like, please don't call me as a bishop. Please don't call me as a bishop. I just quit my job, and I'm like trying to start this company. Uh-huh. And so the hour goes by, and call them up, and they're like, hey, yeah, Bishop so-and-so is just being released. And we've called Bishop Thomas to be the new bishop, and he wants you to be his first counselor. and brother so-and-so is going to be the second counselor. Is that something you're willing to do? And just without hesitation, I'm just like, kind of took a deep breath. Yeah, I could do that. I just didn't even think to pray about it. I just, if the stake is calling me to do something, that's the Lord's will.
Mm-hmm.
I should do it. So it was a lot. But anyways, it was a really, really hard time because, I was starting a new business. I was traveling back and forth between Utah and Nevada regularly. And then I ended up getting a call into the bishopric and trying to balance that. I mean, my week was crazy. Like I would work from, wake up at the crack of dawn, go to the gym, read some scriptures, go to work, be there by 7:30 in the morning, work till 7 at night, Monday through Thursday. And then the weeks I'd go to Nevada, I would get off work, drive at 7 o'clock to Las Vegas, get there about 1 in the morning, wake up the next morning, start work at 6, work till 8 o'clock the next day,
Holy cow.
sleep, go to bed, wake up the next day at 6, work till 3, drive home, get home Saturday night about 10 o'clock, go to sleep, go to church on Sunday, do my bishopric stuff, crash after church for 2 or 3 hours, taking a nap. And that was life for months and months and months.
Whoa.
It was really, really challenging.
What kind of a toll did that take on your family?
It was really tough,
Mm-hmm.
especially on my wife.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. And she, while you're going through it, you just do what you got to do.
Oh, yeah.
And you don't, it's hard going through it for sure, but, sink or swim,
Mm-hmm.
just do what you got to do. But it was really, really hard on her.
Yeah.
So, that's when really, COVID was really when things started to cause me to wake up.
Okay, so explain what happened to us during 2020 and kind of how you really started to wake up.
So I had an interesting experience. I was just so preoccupied with just trying to support a family at the time. And I wasn't paying attention to the news. I'm just like, how do I make this last another month and make sure I pay the bills and pay payroll? And that was my biggest concern. And then, I'd heard of the coronavirus, it was like this thing off in China and this illness, I'm like, yeah, we've had the bird flu, the swine flu, whatever. Like, this is just one of those things. And I remember there was a Subway next to my office that I'd eat at regularly. And there was these two guys sitting at the table and they were talking to each other, talking in Spanish, and they were looking at each other's phones and showing each other videos and stuff and it was pretty obvious they were, I could kind of see the videos, and it was about the coronavirus. And I hadn't paid any attention to it at all. And I just didn't think it was a big deal. But for some reason, while they were talking, I felt the Spirit tell me, this is different. Like, this is significant, and this is going to change the world. And it wasn't literally words, but like that was like the message, the impression that I had in my head. So that's where it started to get more of a bigger and bigger deal, and started to really scare people. At the time, I was a delegate for the Republican Party, a county delegate. And I saw, like, I had to, I'm kind of getting stuff jumbled up here, but it all ties in, I promise. So when I moved, I had kept in touch with my buddy Dave, and there were two other guys, and we had this text messaging group. I jokingly refer to it as my alt-right text group. But it's, we're just really, really good friends. Two of the guys in the text group, though, were both physicians. One is an ER doc, and one is a specialized surgeon. And he also has a master's degree in public health. And so we were paying very close attention to the news. We'd send each other news articles, updating each other on it, and like, this is what I'm seeing, and blah, blah, blah. We're trying to like look for motives in why the government is doing certain things. And they would keep sending me like this research that totally contradicted the mainstream narrative. Now, these guys both have medical degrees. They were indoctrinated more than I was. Mm-hmm. Okay. They accepted the mainstream way of treating people, mm-hmm. but they were looking up these journal articles, and they're saying the exact opposite of what we're being told by Dr. Fauci and the government. And it became very clear to me that there were some ulterior motives here. Mm-hmm. And the masks were doing nothing to protect people from the spread of the virus. And I knew that there was going to be a shot developed mm-hmm. for the coronavirus, for COVID. I'm just like, it's going to happen, and they're going to push it, and they're going to push it hard. And this is going to be their way out of this, way back to normal. And so anyways, another friend of mine, who was the mayor of where we lived, he had gotten in on a call with the governor of Utah and with the other mayors in Utah and the health department in Utah. And this is before the mask mandate took effect. And they started talking in this meeting of implementing a mask mandate. And he called me up afterwards. He's like, hey, just want to give you the heads up. Next Monday, this is probably going to go down, and there's going to be a mask mandate. I'm like, they better not. And so as a delegate, I remember calling all three county commissioners, with all my authority and power as a county delegate, and leaving messages on their voicemails saying, if you vote to implement this mask mandate, I will do everything in my power to get you unelected next time you run for office. Of course, I'm one county delegate. I wasn't going to make any difference, but mm-hmm. I wanted to throw any title or any weight around I could, right? Mm-hmm. And so anyways, next Monday rolls around. Sure enough, I'm listening to the radio, mask mandate. And I was infuriated. I remember going down to the county courthouse that very day during lunch and talking with one of the commissioners, Tanner Ainge, about this mask mandate that they had just implemented. And I remember him, I'm masked up. I'm going around the county buildings, and I'm seeing all these employees not wearing masks. The very day it was implemented, they were not wearing masks. And then I go to the county commissioner, Tanner Ainge, and he pops out of his office after an interview, in that, and someone walks right past him that he was having an interview with. Neither of them were wearing masks. And they were within that magical 6-foot distance of each other,
Yes.
So they probably spread it to each other. But anyways, I ended up talking to him. I handed him this systematic review of studies that talked about how masks are ineffective and they don't work. And he took it. He was polite enough, but you could tell he didn't care. It was all show. And so he was just going along to get along. And that's what he told me. Mm-hmm. And so anyways, I was furious about this because not only was it fraudulent, but they were scaring people unnecessarily, and it was affecting my business. I'm concerned about just paying the bills and making payroll because I'm a fledgling business trying to survive in the world. Mm-hmm. And so I knew from the beginning that it was wrong, and that it was going to cause a lot of damage. And so that kind of gives you a background of where my mind was at when the church started going the same route.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So you're at this point, and then the church is just going right along with it. So what was your reaction to that?
Yeah. So initially, I went along with it. Okay. And looking back, I'm kind of astounded about how I was able to rationalize some of the decisions the church made about this. Initially, it was, I'm in a bishopric, right? I'm getting some leadership training from the stake, who's getting it from the area authorities, and feel like I'm like in the loop kind of what's going on. And yeah, initially I just went along to get along. I'm like, the church doesn't want to stick their neck out there. Totally understandable. They don't want to put themselves at unnecessary risk. So I'm like, okay, I'll mask up at church, no problem. I'm not going to get the shot, but I'll mask up, whatever. And so, did that for a while. We had at-home church, which I loved. Mm-hmm. And then when we came back, we're masking up, we're social distancing every other row, wiping down the microphone, between speakers, just like all this ridiculous stuff.
Yeah, because putting chemicals on a microphone will keep people healthy.
Right.
Totally.
Right. So anyways, eventually things calmed down and the mandate was gone. And so we don't have to wear masks. I'm like, great, things are getting back to normal. And then the first presidency came out with their message about, the only way to, I forget the exact wording, but everyone knows what they said, right? The only way to get rid of this, to go back to normal, essentially, is for the masses to be vaccinated. Mm-hmm. And when they put that message out, I'm like, yeah, they're wrong. Mm-hmm. They're definitely wrong, because we had this previous experience, earlier on in our lives about vaccinations, and we came to the conclusion and felt very, very convinced spiritually that they're not good. They're not what they're touted to be. Mm-hmm. And so when the first presidency was pushing that, and they pushed it the way they did, I'm like, they're wrong. And so that was kind of like the first kind of chink in the armor of the church for me. I'm like, all right, they're wrong here. And so that opened up the possibility of like, well, if they're wrong on this, they could be wrong on other things too. So that really kind of left a sour taste in my mouth. But a few months later, the Omicron variant happened, which was supposed to be just devastating. And of course it wasn't. Mm-hmm. But the church's response was to implement the masks again. Now, so I had gone out of town again. I was going back to Vegas, and while I was gone, they had a leadership meeting with the stake. There was an area authority that came in, and they told the stake and the leadership that they were going to implement the masks again at church. And the advice they gave the leadership, as I remember it, was, we don't want you to tell the membership that they have to put their masks on. We're not going to enforce it on them, but your job as leaders is to set the example. And so we want you to mask up. Anyways, I was gone for that meeting. I come back from I do my gauntlet of a work week, come back, show up to bishopric in the morning, and the bishop says what I just said, like, they want us to wear masks again. And I was just tired of it. I'm like, and just knew it was wrong. And I'm like, I'm not doing it. Like,
good for you.
Yeah. I just didn't feel right about it. Mm-hmm. I'm like, I'm not going to like perpetuate a lie here. Mm-hmm. And so, that at that time we'd also, we we'd been there for 4 years, and we were in a situation that was not great with some of the people in the area. It would take me a long time to explain it, but we decided that we were going to move and sell our house. And so I was going to be going. I'm like, they want me to wear a mask again. I'm not wearing it. And so I didn't wear the mask. And every single week after that, I don't know if this was planned. I don't know. Maybe it was just coincidence, but there was a member of the stake presidency every single week on the stand with us. And so everyone else is masked up. I'm by myself, not wearing a mask. And it was super awkward. It was kind of tough, but like, I'm sticking to my guns. I'm not going to do this. Mm-hmm. To their credit, they never confronted me about it. They let me just do my thing. I think they knew, well, he's going to be going anyways. So I just think they didn't want to deal with it. Mm-hmm. But I could tell, I felt like I could tell, like some of them, it really ruffled their feathers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. All right. So waking up more and more to all the corruption, including in the church. So when did you come to a different point about polygamy? You kind of had an introduction to it. What happened next with your polygamy journey?
Yeah, so that was kind of evolving simultaneous with this. The Joseph Smith Papers project had started, and again, in this text messaging group with my buddies, we were talking about everything. We were talking about the election. We were talking about COVID. We were talking about religious stuff a lot. And, polygamy was a frequent topic. And it was funny because, I'd be working and I'd look down at my phone and there would be 161 unread messages. Some ridiculous number like that. And I would just kind of joking, I'd take a screenshot of it and send it to the group. I'm like, you guys must be talking about polygamy. But my buddy Dave, he was really into researching this topic in particular and just religious stuff in general. That's just his thing. That's his passion. And so he was looking at the Joseph Smith Papers, and he would send us little snippets and information as they would come out. And over time, like, it's funny. It's like, if there's a spectrum between Joseph Smith was a polygamist over here and Joseph Smith was not a polygamist over here, I was over here initially. And then over time, just kind of gradually, incrementally, I became more open to the idea. Mm-hmm. And then, this whole situation with COVID happened, and I'm like, well, they can be wrong on stuff. And then I'm noticing like these changes in the journal entries. Mm-hmm. And I'm, noticing that, oh wait, Jacob 2:30 is not necessarily what they say it means. And
what were some of the resources that you were using to kind of learn these things?
Blogs was one of them. There's different people who wrote about it. The Joseph Smith Papers, like I said. And really it accelerated after I moved from that place I was while I was in that bishopric. Because somehow I got, I believe it was a video sent to me from the same group. It was a Rob Fotheringham video. Mm-hmm. And it was, who was the first polygamist, Brigham or Joseph? Yeah. And by this point, I'd kind of come far enough along the spectrum to be open.
You were ready.
Right. I was ready to hear it and consider it. Whereas years before, I wouldn't have considered it all. Mm-hmm. Right. And so anyways, I listened to it, and there was not one thing, but like when we moved, I went from like about neutral to like speeding towards the other end of the spectrum of, Joseph wasn't a polygamist. This is completely wrong. And so Rob Fotheringham, Michelle Stone, I remember coming across Whitney Horning, I read her book. But Michelle Stone, I remember YouTube, good old Big Brother with its algorithm, throwing this Michelle Stone interview in my feed. Mm-hmm. And it was her interviewing on Ward Radio, which before was known as Midnight Mormons.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And anyways, the title of the video was something like she believes Joseph didn't practice polygamy or something like that. I'm like, oh, cool. Listen to that. And I remember just being floored by her. I'm like, man, this lady just can rattle off answers so quickly. She was just so sharp and on top of things, and just she had an answer for everything they threw at her.
Yeah, she knows her stuff.
She really does.
Mm-hmm.
I remember just being so impressed by that. And by this point, I'm like, yeah, he wasn't a polygamist. But I remember sending that video off to a bunch of people and just thinking, Michelle Stone, now this lady is sharp as a razor. And she really is. But like, it was a lot of things, Jeremy Hoop and his material, that was really good. He's just such a great presenter and just articulate and just it's got really good information. But, it became at one point, it's like, this is so obvious. I don't know why. But again, it's that paradigm people come from, like I was talking about earlier. Like if you're the mindset that the brethren cannot make errors, then you can't see it.
Yeah.
You're just impervious to it. So it's like being in a trance.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so all this awakening is happening. What did it kind of do to your view of the church and your practices in the church? What did that look like?
As far as like attending, I kept attending. I still attend church. I still see a lot of value in it. It made me a little bitter initially. Like I was really upset and disappointed that this narrative that I'd been taught my whole life, this paradigm that I had viewed truth through, was just kind of shattered.
Right.
And I had to kind of rebuild things. Luckily, I had experiences that really anchored myself down to know I'm like there's a God. The Book of Mormon is true, but how do I deal with this, these new ideas, and how does it fit into this paradigm? And so it's, I just kept digging, and I came across, different podcasts like Jacob Isbell's podcast, Disciple of Christ, and I'm hearing of these people who have had baptisms of fire. I start studying the scriptures, the Book of Mormon. I started studying more about the Gentiles, and I used to view the Gentiles as just white Europeans, right? That just came over from Europe to America and colonized America, and that's who they were as a group. And so when I would read these prophecies in the Book of Mormon about the Gentiles, that's who I thought it was talking about.
It's like these people over here.
And so when it talks about, like in 2nd Nephi, the Gentiles rejecting the fullness of the gospel, I'm like, oh, well, yeah, these Protestants and Catholics and stuff, they're not opening the door to our young missionaries.
Right.
Yeah,
that's what we all think when we start this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, as I started considering the idea that no, that's not who it's talking about. It's talking about us. I mean, there is that element in the Book of Mormon where it does talk about Gentiles as a group, right?
Right.
But specifically, how can you reject the fullness of the gospel if you don't have it, if you don't even know about it?
Right.
The
Book of Mormon was written for the people who read the Book of Mormon. That isn't the Protestants and the non-denominational Christians. That is the Mormons, the people reading the Book of Mormon.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so, there's that scripture, I forget where it's at, but when I believe it's in 2nd Nephi, it talks about, the churches that are built up to say, I am the Lord's. I am the Lord's.
Yeah.
I mean, what are we saying?
Well, definitely. And there's the story of the Rameumptom where everyone's going up on the tower and saying, oh, Holy Lord, we're so glad we're so much holier than everybody else. And then they come down off their tower. They go about their days. They don't think about God at all. These are the patterns that we're seeing in the LDS Church and in pretty much all of mainstream religion at this time.
Absolutely. And so when I flipped that and I, again, considered the idea that maybe I need to take a hard look at myself and ask myself the hard questions instead of assuming that the Book of Mormon and all of its warnings are directed towards other people. Then I'm like, oh no. It's like you start to wake up to your awful situation and realize that we've got some repenting to do individually and collectively as people who are members of, one branch of the Restoration Church or another.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, definitely. There's a work to be done amongst all of us Christians. And I think that's one of the things we're trying to do here. So,
yeah.
Okay. So any other spiritual experiences you had that brought you closer to Christ at this time?
Yeah. So, another big part of my journey, again, going back to my friend from Las Vegas, Dave, when he told me of his experience, it left such an impression on me. Like, I want that experience myself. And, he told me, well, this is how I did it. These are the steps that I took. You can see these patterns in the scripture of how people come to God. Nephi did this, Enos did this, the brother of Jared did this. And this is how they had these experiences. These are experiences that, if God is really the same yesterday, today, and forever, then if he loves me and he loves you as much as he loves Alma the Younger or the brother of Jared, if he's an equal opportunity God, then those same experiences should be available to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started to, and then you read the lectures on faith, and it talks about that. It kind of sets up in a step-by-step manner how to go from faith to knowledge and how to enter into the presence of God, essentially. And so I'm like, well, look, like I've only got one life, I might as well like swing for the fence and do everything in my power to be able to have these experiences. And so I started really studying and trying to get my life more in line with God's will and studying the baptism of fire and the baptism of the Holy Ghost. And initially I thought they were the same thing. But now I kind of lean towards them being two different things personally. I know there's some debate about that, but anyways, there was a period of time where I really made an effort. There was 41 weeks straight. It was kind of funny, but 41 weeks straight, I would fast one day a week. And I'm like, I can't fast 40 days straight. I know some people do water fasts or whatever, but like I'm like, I can't do that with like my job and stuff. There's no way I can do that. So I'll take one day a week for 40 weeks, and ended up being 41 weeks, and fast and try and just get that broken heart and that contrite spirit and be able to have a born again experience. And I did that. And by the end of it, I prayed to have the experience, and nothing happened. Kind of like my first time reading the Book of Mormon, I didn't get an answer. And I was really disappointed. I'm like, man, I put on all this effort, and what I wanted didn't happen. And I just kind of left it at that for a while. I mean, I was still putting forth effort. I was still praying very, very diligently, and I had a lot of growth spiritually, just in developing my relationship with God, trying to learn how to communicate with him, not just going through the motions of, rolling over and kneeling down at the edge of my bed and saying my, 30-second prayer, a couple-minute prayer, and then calling it good. Like, these are really intense prayers, and I had some really interesting experiences with them. But the 41 weeks of fasting didn't result in what I had hoped for. But interestingly enough, this last summer I was diagnosed with cancer, and not a serious form of cancer. I jokingly call it cancer light.
If that's a thing.
It's very treatable, very, very treatable. I've never been worried about about dying from it, but it's cancer, right? You have to take it seriously, because if you don't do something about it, it will kill you. And so anyways, as I'm researching about it, I came across some information about fasting and how fasting can affect cancer. And so I started thinking about that again. And at the time, I had a good friend who had done a 3-day fast, a water fast. And he's a guy I know from the gym, really good friend. And I saw him just suffer through that. And I'm like, oh man, I've thought about doing that, but he did it for health purposes. I think he's the type of guy that just likes to push himself to see how far he can push his body. He might have had some other motives in that, but anyways, it kind of put the idea in my head. And then I get this diagnosis and I'm like, I want to try this. And so I made a plan to fast for 3 days, and I did it. And the whole time I was writing in my journal the impressions that I got and trying to follow really closely what the Lord wanted me to do. And I was doing it and feeling like I was getting some spiritual impressions, nothing like super profound. But by the end of it, the third night, I remember getting off work, and it was interesting because I live in San Pete County, but my job is in Utah County in American Fork. And I had some stuff to do, so I ended up just staying in Utah County at my in-laws' house. And that night, and I was alone, I was all by myself. And just remember praying a lot. And I wasn't alone by myself. My daughter, who's just gotten to college, was there, but she was off doing stuff. And so I hung out with her for a while. She left. Went by myself and praying, and then nothing was happening. Read some scriptures, nothing was happening. Fell asleep. All of a sudden, I hear this big bang on the window, and I'm like startled awake. It's like midnight, and it was my daughter. She had locked herself out. So I'm awake. I let her in. I'm really annoyed, and I couldn't go back to sleep. And so I was just sitting there in bed. I'm like, well, I'm not doing anything. I'll say some more prayers and read some scriptures, and nothing was happening. And so I left. It's like 1 o'clock in the morning. I'm driving around Provo, just where I grew up and stuff, and just kind of talking to God, and just kind of venting my frustrations out. I get back. I'm reading the scriptures again. 2 Nephi 31 to 33. I read John chapter 3. I read Alma 5. Just these chapters on the baptism of fire and the Holy Ghost. And the next morning, one of the impressions that I had while I was doing this 3-day fast was to meditate. And so the next morning I go to work. I'm in my van before work, and I just am praying again and meditating, and I'm just focusing on my breathing, and just had this really calm feeling come across me. And it wasn't a baptism of fire, but it was just kind of like calming down my disappointment. And then went about my day, and broke my fast. And then I'm not sure if it was that night or the night after, but I was getting ready for bed, and I was text messaging again my buddy Dave. He had text messaged me about something before, and I responded. And I looked at one of my previous text messages, and the topic we were talking about was the divine feminine. Okay. And I made the comment, I'm like, I think Heavenly Mother is the Holy Ghost. And I think that, it makes sense. Like if we're baptized by fire and the Holy Ghost, it makes sense like the Heavenly Mother is the Holy Ghost, because men don't give birth. Women do, right? Mm-hmm. And so we're born again. That's what what being born again is the baptism of fire and the Holy Ghost. I'm like, wouldn't it be fitting and make sense if it was Heavenly Mother, because she would be the one in essence to do that process. And I'm like, yeah, Nicodemus talked about, can a man enter his mother's womb a second time and be born again? When he's answering Jesus Christ's, explanation of this. And that's kind of what happens. I'm like, I wonder. And I texted my friend. He's like, yeah, I believe that actually. And I remember thinking like, man, that is just beautiful. Like the Godhead is the Father and the Mother and the Son. And those three are trying to reclaim their family. They're trying to save their family that has been down in this fallen world with Satan, Lucifer, as the god of this world. And it's through Christ and his atonement that we are saved. And I just remember thinking, man, that is just really a wonderful, beautiful idea there. And as I thought that, it was an interesting experience. It was like the veil was almost like just split. Like I didn't see anything, but the love of God was just present. And it was almost like an intuition, like a knowledge. I don't know how to describe it, an experience of like, this is what the love of God feels like. And it was amazing, amazing experience. And, I thought to myself, I'm like, man, if you could describe God in one word, it's love. And later on, as I was thinking about that, I'm like, there's a scripture that says that God is love. Mm-hmm. And so this fasting, I don't believe that experience was a baptism of the Holy Ghost, but it was a wonderful answer to and a witness of God's redeeming love to me. So that's kind of where I'm at. I'm still seeking after truth. I'm still seeking after that higher witness and trying to go along the pathway to come in the presence of God. But it's a wonderful journey.
That's really beautiful. The love of God is really what changes us and changes our hearts and our paths in life, because then it's like we're set on fire for Jesus and we just want to do whatever it is that he calls us to do. And so that's a really powerful, beautiful experience. So you're still in the church, right?
I'm still in the church. Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So tell us a little bit about, maybe give a couple tips. How do you navigate being in the church when you know there's corruption in the church?
Well, if you don't want a calling, don't dress like you want one. Don't wear a tie, wear sandals, don't wear a white shirt, and you become kryptonite to them all of a sudden. But joking aside, okay? I've listened to enough of your interviews, Claire. Like I used to be less open-minded than I am right now. When I would hear of someone leaving the church, I'm like, kind of get annoyed about it. I'm like, I don't. But now, like understanding, hearing enough stories, I believe everyone has their own journey. Okay, when Lehi was commanded to leave Jerusalem, Jeremiah stayed. Okay, some people are asked to go out. They're prompted by the Spirit to leave, and yes. I accept that. I've got no problem with that. Conversely, some people, I believe their place is to stay in the church. And right now, that's where I'm at. I don't agree with everything that's said. I find myself at times rolling my eyes. There was a time that I was really just struggling to go, because I'm like, I don't feel like I'm being nourished. I don't feel like I'm getting anything out of this. I had a lot of bitterness towards what I felt like was deception, a false message that was being taught to me my whole life. But I've settled down on that. I'm not like that anymore. The way I look at it is, you know what? It's not a perfect institution. There are a lot of people here that are really good people that are trying. I was there, we all were there at some point. At least most of the people, I believe, on your podcast were members at one point.
Yes.
And so everyone's got their own journey. And so I think that just following the Spirit and accepting people, not judging, and accepting people for who they are, where they're at, and just loving them. And I think that's the key.
Sure. What do you feel like is your role within the church to be a true disciple of Christ? Because, we talked about drifting earlier. Seems like you're on a path that you do not want to be drifting. So maybe what's kind of like your tips or advice for people? Because it's so easy to drift in these institutions, any institution really.
Yeah.
What's your advice? How do you keep from drifting? What are you doing to be that true disciple until either God calls you out or whatever the next step is for your journey?
That's a great question. I think God has a way of, at some point, making you choose. Like, you can't stay on neutral ground.
No.
Yeah. And so you either humble yourself or you're compelled to be humble. There's been times in my life where I feel like God has really humbled me and forced my hand on certain things. And there's times where, things are going well, I'm coasting, and I'm at the point right now that I know that's not acceptable. Says in Revelation that if you're lukewarm, God will spew you out of his mouth.
Yes.
And so I think as long as we're self-aware of that, and we're trying to not just read the scriptures, not just pray, not just go through the motions, but like really try and sink your teeth in it and apply those teachings to your life, is the way to do it. Like I said, God is a way of trying to push you the direction he needs you to go, whether that's through crises that you have or people that are put in your life. But ultimately, hopefully you have the humility and you're living your life in a way that you can recognize when those opportunities are there.
Mm-hmm, definitely. And there's also a cool dynamic here in that when you're mainstream LDS, this conversation wouldn't be happening. Like, people can't look at people like me who are out of the church and be like, they really love Jesus. It's like they're an apostate. And so like this conversation is evidence of like what Jesus does in our hearts. Because you're in the church, I'm out of the church. We're cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so to see that and to see how God works in the hearts of individuals is about where your heart is. It's not about what institution you're in or out or whatever. It's about where your heart is. It just changes how we interact with people and how we really let the love of the gospel change our hearts and our lives. So thank you for illustrating that for us. So how do you find clarity after all this, all your awakening? How do you find clarity?
Oh, I've thought about that question. Honestly, I think the clarity often comes after the trial of your faith. Like Moroni says in Ether 12, you receive no witness until after the trial of your faith. I feel like that has been the pattern of my life, that I've got to go through those mists of darkness for a while before I get that clarity, Yeah. And once you get out of those and then you look back in hindsight, you see, oh, okay, that's why this happened. That's why that happened. This makes so much more sense now. And I think that experience of just pushing through trials, getting that witness after the fact helps you for the next trial or obstacle that you have in your way.
Yes, absolutely. Sometimes we just got to hang on for dear life to our faith until that trial passes and we see so much. I've always said that I actually believe that the baptism by fire, you have to undergo a little bit of fire to get there. Whether or not people agree with me is whatever, but there's so much to be said for that, and God will teach us through the fire. So, and we will gain that clarity. Absolutely. So keep your faith no matter what we're going through. So thank you so much, Scott, for coming on the podcast. It's been a pleasure.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
If you guys are interested in joining us for an episode of the Clarity Podcast where you share your story of how you have left mainstream religion to follow Jesus Christ, please feel free to reach out to me at clarity.podcast@gmail.com, or you can find me on my website at forgedinhisfire.com, or you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at forgedinhisfire. Thanks so much, guys, for joining us on this week's episode of the Clarity Podcast.